I'm John Duval. Welcome to the Scriptural Way Bible Study. The Scriptural Way Bible Study is brought to you by the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, located at 16300 North May Avenue, Oklahoma City. On behalf of the elders and members of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, I would like to thank you for your interest in spiritual matters. Now, let's take our Bibles and seek the Scriptural Way. Good evening. I'm John Duval.
I'm John Hall.
And this is the Scriptural Way broadcast. Welcome to our study. John, how are you doing this fine evening?
I'm doing okay.
Lot different week than we had last Tuesday night, isn't it?
Well, I never know. There's a little storm down South Oklahoma City.
I'm
not sure which way they're going, but
well,
hadn't watched the weather in a couple hours.
If you were watching last week's broadcast, you'll remember that right at the tail end we had to cut it off very short because tornado sirens were afoot. It was pretty bad, at least the sirens were. And so what we did is while we were scurrying around in the foyer during the hailstorm that was falling and keeping us from leaving, is we went ahead and shot a little video of it. And so just so you'll know what we were dealing with, I've got Travis ready to cue that up. There won't be any sound to it, so we'll kind of talk in the background, I guess. But just watch. This is what was falling on us last week. That's my car right there. And when I previously had bought the car, it had hail damage on it. And so we had the hail damage taken care of. And thankfully, what you see falling there did not damage it too badly. We are very, very grateful for that. So,
yeah, we were a little bit in the lighter section of the hail. There was some bigger stuff than that, and a little farther east and in northern Edmond.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think the worst that I got in that is the rubber. There's some rubber parts on the car took the dings.
Yeah.
But I was very, very grateful that it wasn't anything worse than that. But you're right, it was larger in other areas, and as a result, some people did receive more hail damage.
Yeah, there was a lot of cars with windows completely blown out, and my mother-in-law's car had hail damage all over it. She was parked in our driveway, and
really,
it was pretty thick. My siding's got holes all in it, and
your house there?
Yeah, not sure about the roof yet. We'll see how that goes once they come out and look at it.
That's not good. Yeah. Well, in here at the building, we received a little bit of damage on the south end of the building. They had to come in and kind of look at it. There was water coming in. And afterwards, I went back behind the baptistry, hitting it at full speed ahead so I could adjust the ACs, because we were putting up a few people last week who were waiting outside, and so we let them come in. And I about nearly hit the deck when I hit that water. So it was a slippery situation for a moment. Well, I'll tell you where we left off last week. We're going to conclude our study of what does the Bible say about women preachers. And if you haven't downloaded a copy of the lesson, please do so. It's in PDF format. If you missed any of the previous two studies, you can go back and look at them. If you'll click on, after the broadcast, if you'll click on previous studies, the first one to load up will be last week's. And then there will be a link up to the upper right area just past the viewing window, and click that, and you can choose the episode previous to that to go back even farther. But we're picking up tonight. We were in our discussion of the guidelines taught by Paul, in this case in point, 1 Timothy chapter 2, 11 through 15. And we're going to take a moment and read that, and then just make a couple comments to finish up that point, and then we'll step into the last section of the lesson. So, notice with me in 1 Timothy 2, beginning of verse 11. Paul wrote, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness with self-control." Now, John, we've looked at several different definitions last week, so we won't go through those again. And we pointed out that what Paul is not teaching is he's not forbidding women from teaching in general. We have examples of women teaching in the Bible. Priscilla with Aquila taught Apollos. Right. Just different examples. Timothy's mother and his grandmother taught him. But John, what would you say Paul is teaching?
Well, first off, Paul is teaching the women to neither teach over nor to have authority over the man.
Okay.
And the women are to learn in silence in that regard in the worship services.
That's right. That's exactly right. We talked about the Greek word that we translated earlier or that we saw that's translated as silence there. And he's not saying that the woman is to remain speechless, but as we saw in 1 Corinthians 14, she's not to address the assembly.
Right.
And it's she can't. It's not that Paul's saying you can't correct your child or you can't sing, nothing like that. You just can't speak in a public fashion in the public worship service where there are faithful men present.
Right. And I think most everybody on here was probably on last week, but it probably wouldn't hurt to mention the fact that the verses that we were talking about last week, as Paul had told those who might be prophesying,
True.
to remain silent if someone else was moved to have a prophecy.
Same Greek word. That's right.
To speak. And so that individual was to remain silent. And so in that case, the same word didn't mean for that person to remain absolutely mute and not utter a sound. And the same case is here for the woman.
Exactly. Same thing with the tongue speaker.
Right.
You see the word speak, word silent, and speak is a public address. Silence is to not utter a word, but in that context, not to address publicly. Yeah. So with that in mind there, let's talk for just a moment or two about the woman's involvement in the work of the local church. And this is really what concerns me. It's because people will look at the one or two verses and we say, well, a woman can't preach. Well, then a woman can't do anything. Poor little women, they can't do anything in worship service. But in reality, that's anything but the truth. Because when you sit down and you look at it, you can maybe count on your hand the number of things that a woman cannot do publicly when faithful men are present. But worship service involves much more than those handful of things. Mm-hmm. For instance think about the various assemblies that we talked about earlier. When the church comes together to worship God, when they partake of the Lord's Supper, when they give of their means, when they sing, when they pray, and they follow along during the sermons, a woman does that just as a man does. It's oftentimes people will look at, she can't wait on the table. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? What she's doing when she breaks the bread and partakes of the fruit of the vine is far more important than standing up there and passing the tray. I mean, it's more important, the aspect of partaking of the Lord's Supper. Praying, a woman can't stand up and lead a public prayer when there are faithful men present, here in the assembly. But what is she supposed to do when he is praying? The same thing that everybody else does. Praying unto God. Mm-hmm. Same thing with singing, same thing, and it just concerns me, the motives of people when they pick up she can't lead singing when men are present, she can't lead a prayer, she can't wait on the table, she can't bring a sermon. Well, then a woman can't do anything. No. Right. It's farthest from the truth.
And even the men could have that same attitude if we take it to the extreme of, we have elders in the congregation.
Right.
Well, I'm not allowed to be an elder over the elders. I'm not appointed as an elder.
Right.
They have that responsibility, that role as leadership for the congregation to shepherd the flock. In that regard, I'm not allowed to go in and take and usurp their authority.
Right.
And try to shepherd the flock. But I have no problems with that.
It doesn't lessen your work in the church.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's like it lessens our work as members if we can't do A, B, C, or D, and that's the farthest from the truth.
Right. And I think that's what we're focusing on. It's not so much what one can do and what one can't do. It's the fact that we all have certain responsibilities, certain roles to play, certain roles to fill. No different as we started off in the beginning of the lesson with the husband-wife relationship. The husband has a responsibility in a certain role, and the wife has responsibilities in certain roles. Right. They just happen to be different.
Exactly, and that must not be overlooked. What about evangelism? Do women have a part to play in the evangelistic process? They better.
Outside the church, and even inside the church.
Even inside the church.
And what's interesting to me is that I think of a woman sitting in congregation and doing just like the men who are sitting in the congregation, listening to the lesson.
Right.
Being respectful to the preacher, following the shepherd, I don't know if that's a word, shepherdship, the leadership of the elders, being an example, essentially, to the other Christians that are around them. And through that example, they are essentially teaching others in that.
Exactly.
They're not usurping authority as they do so, but they're fulfilling their roles in the congregation, and in doing that, they're even teaching.
Well, in the singing, we're supposed to speak to one another, teaching one another, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs.
Right.
What if you have someone who's not a Christian there? And we sing a song at the close of the sermon, the invitation song. And so here she is, she's standing next to this person who's not a Christian, and he's listening not only to the words that he's singing on the page, but to what she's singing and everybody else. She's in a measure and a fashion teaching that individual. And outside of the body of Christ, we all have an equal responsibility to evangelize.
Right.
She can teach anybody and everybody that she has an opportunity to go up to and teach.
And it's a lot of cases, and I'm not sure if this is a general truth or not, but it seems like women sometimes are gentler when it comes to teaching certain topics. Men sometimes are a little too straightforward. Not that we shouldn't be straightforward,
right,
but sometimes men may be a little bit rough around the edges at it, and sometimes maybe set certain personalities off that we might be trying to teach. Some individuals have personalities where we would end up, causing them to argue more than just to discuss.
Right.
Whereas a lot of times it seems like women are just more adept at having that conversation in a very peaceful manner. You don't often see women arguing at each other about these types of things, or about any topic, generally speaking. I'm not saying that there aren't any women out there that might be of that nature, but generally women don't typically just have knock-down, drag-out arguments over issues, and I've seen plenty of men do that.
That's true. There is a certain typically a gentler demeanor.
Still straightforward, still teaching the truth, not trying to skirt the issues, not trying to avoid the issues, but just in their ways. They're softer by nature, maybe that's the way to.
There's some husband out there, have you met my wife? That's a little different relationship there. But I think it's a very good point there. Women make great teachers, not just to little kids either. And we talked about that last week some in regards to the teaching process.
Right.
Benevolence.
Yeah, women can participate in benevolent work of the church. Obviously, women have just as much responsibility to give of their means as they prospered. With as they purposed in their heart, just as much as a man would.
I think about oftentimes people consider their benevolence that they do each week, the check that they write to the church. Well, the church will help people. The church will do this or that. Cutting a check and giving it to the church in the contribution is not the end of your responsibility as a member of the church regarding benevolence.
Right.
If you have an opportunity to help a brother and sister in Christ, you help them. It doesn't even have to be a brother or sister in Christ as far as you as an individual. You have a responsibility to help anyone that you have the means and the opportunity to do. But as far as the work of the local church, there may be members who are in need, members who are sick, members who need to be tended to. And there are times, going back to what you were just saying about teaching, there are times that women are better at fulfilling those needs. I mean, I could cook for somebody, but I'm telling you what, when I was a kid, I didn't like fried squash. Well, we planted a little mini garden in individual tubs there, and Rhonda decided to fry up the 3 squash we picked the other day, and that was so good for supper tonight. It was a lot like little bitty chips. I mean, someone said that's why they're so good. You got all the batter and the seasoning. But women do a better job at that.
Right.
Or in my household.
Right.
But not just that, but there's so many compassion, and everything tends to be a little better there on the part of women. Yeah. We have a Bible example of that, don't we?
Yes, we do. Look over Romans chapter 16, verse 1 and 2.
Let's take a look at that for a moment.
Well, Romans chapter 16, verse 1 says, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. For indeed she has been a helper of many, and of myself also.
Exactly.
You just caught me off guard. I was thinking another thought, and you jumped in. I mean, I wasn't ready for that.
Well, sorry about that.
That's all right. No, I was just thinking. There's been many times in the past where we've been part of congregations where members were in need, but it didn't really, it didn't rise up to the level where really the church would have been responsible or required to provide for that need. It might have been a one-time situation where they needed some assistance, and the members of the church simply came together and gave to those individuals on a separate basis. And that goes back to what you're saying. Not always is it you write your check and put it in the offering, and then you should never expect anybody to ask for anything or need anything from that point on.
Yeah, go talk to the elders.
Right.
I've already helped.
Right, I've already given my portion. Exactly.
Well, and although Paul does not teach it this way regarding benevolence, but I think about what he says regarding taking care of your own widows, so the church be not burdened. I think there are times with benevolence we as individuals can help first, so the church is not burdened unless there is a call for that.
Right.
Yeah. So, with that being said, what does the Bible say about women preachers? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Women, and Chance put this in the chat room, 1 Timothy 2:12, women are not to teach over or usurp authority of the man. I had an older preacher years ago told me, when you look at the verse, so I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over. You look at it, I suffer not a woman to teach over, nor usurp authority over the man there. And with that being understood, we recognize women are equal in the sight of God, equal with men.
Right.
You know, there's nothing, when God looks down upon men and women, he doesn't look at the men as being a greater creation than the woman or vice versa. But you said a while ago, it's roles and guidelines.
Right.
Yeah.
If everybody had the same role, there'd be some roles that just would go unfulfilled.
Exactly. When I was growing up, I used to like watch Sesame Street, and I don't remember if they were as liberal as they are today. But one of the things I remember is about potato salad at a cookout. If everybody brought potato salad, then where would all the other stuff be?
Yeah.
You
It'd
know,
be a sad cookout.
It would be a sad cookout. You know, and same with the little congregation. We all have different roles, different parts to play, different aspects as members, as Paul talks about. And women's no lesser than men whatsoever. Yeah. Any thoughts?
And one thing women can do just as well, and if not better sometimes as well, is just the general encouragement of the saints. You know, we see a lot of women in our congregation who will hang around after services, and will talk to individuals, and they will go up just as much as an elder would to an individual who may be going through difficult times, and they will encourage them and they'll comfort them. And women, as you mentioned earlier about better providing with cooking issues, are much better comforters.
Yeah.
They're much better at those types of issues. Some men are very good at that. Some men struggle in that area, but most all women are fairly adept at kind comforting and consoling,
instinct, maybe.
And so a lot of times, and I think in our congregation we excel with that as well. Our women are very good about going up and talking to individuals that they know are going through difficult times, and then just not necessarily trying to, quiz them or trying to, figure out all the problems in their life, but just simply being there for them, comforting them, and offering them, maybe some needed advice.
We've got some older ladies who are maybe limited by their physical disabilities to certain things. Like this Saturday, we're going to go door to door and pass out flyers about our upcoming gospel meeting, which I failed to tell you about, and I'll reserve it for the end of the broadcast because there's another announcement that follows that. But what they will do is they'll send visitors cards. They'll call people. That they will pick up the phone when they cannot get out of the house. They will pick up their phone and call people. And all with us who have more mobility and greater physical abilities, we do less. And I think it's just a strong lesson to learn. So, any thoughts to bring in?
Yeah, let me. Randall had mentioned Galatians 6, verse 10, as it relates to doing good and providing for others.
Absolutely.
Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Let us, as Christians, as saints, as brethren, especially of those of the household of faith. Craig, Benny had looked at Proverbs 31, verse 20. She extends her hand to the poor. Yes, she reaches out her hands to the needy.
That's right.
And so, and many times women, especially in that day and age, might have more opportunity to know who are needy. As the men may be, especially those that work in the field, they would be in the field all day long working.
That's a good point.
Then you would come home and you might, hopefully, as a Christian, you would come home and do your Bible study, lead your family, and have family time.
Right.
But most of the day, you were working and you were toiling in the field.
Yeah.
And the woman would be home providing for the family and maybe visiting those who are in need and have opportunities, more so than men would have opportunities to identify those in need and go out and tend to those needs.
It's a very good point. Very good point.
And Randall looked at 1 Corinthians 12, verse 20 through 26.
In our discussion about us being members of the body of equal membership.
Right.
Yeah.
And, identifying, of course, that there is no greater or lesser part.
Well, I like the fact what Paul brings up, and Randall puts us in here, the fact that a person cannot say to another person, well, because you're not me, I don't have a need for you. Mm-hmm. Nor, as you continue on that, can a person say, well, because I can't do that, I'm not a member of the body.
Right.
It's, we're all necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
And finally, Chance had put in Romans 3:22, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ, unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference.
For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God is the following verse in that. Mm-hmm. That's right. It's exactly right.
Right.
Appreciate your comments on that. And that brings us, of course, to the end of that lesson. We might have been able to finish it up last week had there not been a tornado warning in our area. And some of you weren't online right at the very start. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you the video we shot last week one more time. And as soon as that is completed, we'll segue into our first break. And then we come back, we'll start our new lesson. So here's what we were looking at last week, about 10 minutes after the broadcast was over with. We no sooner got back to the foyer, and it was just coming down. I mean, it was bad. And what I didn't show you on the video was out the west door. There was, 3 or 4 cars parked out there? 4 or 5,
yeah.
Some of them just right up near the glass, nearly.
Yeah.
And so John opened the door and probably let maybe 7 people into the building, and they took what refuge they could and everything. And they we're here probably about an hour. Were we here about an hour after broadcast?
Yeah, 45 minutes to an hour maybe at the most.
Well, waiting on the hail to finish up and make sure the storm was going to settle down and everything. Mm-hmm. So let's go ahead and head on into our first break. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Ron Witt, one of the elders of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ. On behalf of the elders and members of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, I would like to invite you to be our guest at any of our worship services and Bible classes. The meeting place of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ is located at 16300 North May Avenue, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, zip code 73013. The Seminole Pointe Church of Christ meets Sunday mornings at 9:30 for Bible classes, 10:30 for worship service, and 5 p.m. for our afternoon worship service. We also have Bible classes on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Whether you live in Oklahoma City area or you are traveling through Oklahoma City, we would love to have you come and be our guest. We have Bible classes for all ages. At the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, our focus is to teach only the Word of God. Rest assured that when you visit with us, you will find that we will appeal only to God's precious Word. Now, let us return to our study.
Welcome back to our study. Before we step into our next lesson, what does the Bible say about the local church and human institutions? A couple things I need to mention to you. If you haven't downloaded a PDF copy of it, please do so. That should be available beneath the viewing window. The second thing is, our gospel meeting begins this Sunday with Maurice Barnett, and it will run through Thursday night. Now, we won't have the broadcast on Tuesday night, obviously, because we'll be in the middle of services. And we always live stream the 30-minute singing, which starts at 7 o'clock, followed by the worship services at 7:30. Now, our time Sunday morning will be the same, 9:30 and 10:30, but Sunday night we'll meet at 7, Monday through Thursday at 7 as well. On Tuesday night, I may go ahead and set our window up on the Scriptural Way to go ahead and stream the services, just in case someone comes and they don't know that we're not on air that night. They'll be able to watch services there. And I have some explanation. After that, a couple of us here are going to be out of town, not together and not the same, almost the same weeks. We'll overlap a little bit. So as a result, we're going to take a hiatus until July 10th. July 10th. So this will be our last broadcast until July 10th. And when we resume in July, the first lesson out of the gate is, what does the Bible say about alcohol in the life of a Christian? So we'll start on that July 10th.
One question I want you to be thinking of.
Yes.
Alan asked this last night. We were looking at a lesson. When did the word drinking, just using the word drinking, when did that automatically become understood as drinking alcohol? Isn't that interesting?
It's our culture.
So just something to think about.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, because you're right. Nowadays, if you're talking to someone,
are you a drinker? Well, yeah, I drink all the time.
Yeah.
No, we know what they're talking about.
You got a drinking problem? It's like that old movie. It's a good question. You know, when did the vernacular come in to expression where drinking implies an alcoholic beverage? It could be one of those things that context means everything.
Yeah.
You know, as well there.
Sorry, I threw you off there.
Randy says in the chat room real quick, Christian men like you should not fear hail. H-A-I-L.
Yeah.
Or
Southern slang, hail.
exactly there. Thank you. We're glad we're safe as well. So when you mark that on your calendar, July 10th was when we will resume with what does the Bible say about alcohol. But we're going to kind of squeeze in here to about the last 35 minutes of our study tonight. Just a brief look at what does the Bible say about the local church and human institutions. Now, what we mean by institutions, we're going to have a definition up on the screen here. The Merriam-Webster's online dictionary defines the word institution as an act of instituting establishment. 2, a significant practice, relationship, or organization in society or culture, like the institution of marriage. Also, something or someone firmly associated with a thing or place, as in she has become an institution in the theater. An established organization or corporation is a bank or university, especially of a public character, also, such as an asylum.
So say that word theater again.
Theater. Theater, yeah, no, he's had classes up our broadcast a little bit. But in this lesson, we look at the word institution. We're basically looking at the latter portion of that, where it talks about an established organization or corporation, a group of people. Now, in our lives, there are various types of institutions. Marriage is an institution, okay, not an asylum, but an institution. There is a family institution, the educational institution. There's a governmental institution, institutions of charity. You've got a business or a company that'd be considered an institution, and even the local church. Now, someone says, what's your point? The point is that some of these institutions are divined or established by God, like the marriage, the family, the local church. Some of these institutions are established by man. Think about the educational, governmental, charity institution, businesses, companies, etc.
And of course, governmental, we could argue about a little bit. That'd be kind of dual.
Yeah.
Today's age is typically set up in the order and function of it.
Yeah, and you know, that is a very good point, because
I didn't mean to argue on that, but
no,
I knew
that's
where you were
okay.
going.
We need a
with
good
this.
argument from time to time. Because you think about it, the home is an institution established by God, but not every marriage is approved by God.
Right.
You know, a family could be a mother and 4 children out of wedlock. Well, while the family is institution ordained by God, that situation is not approved of by God. You know, the actions do there. So the government, according to Romans 13, in effect is ordained or given authority by God,
right,
but not the specific government that we vote
right.
in. Yeah, I think that's a good point there. Now, the point behind bringing all these up is that each institution is independent in function, practice, and rules from other institutions. For instance, the rules and practices of the educational system are inadequate for the home.
Right.
You can't govern the home by the educational system.
Right.
You cannot govern a corporation by the governmental institution.
Mm-hmm.
The goal of a business or company is not the same goal as a charity organization or educational institution.
Right. The rules of the family do not apply to local church.
Well, that's exactly right.
And of course, the rules of the local church, I'll get that out, do not apply to the marriage relationship.
Exactly. And so that's the point. We recognize that there are a variety of institutions of which we are a part within our individual lives. Mm-hmm. But each one is separate and has no part, if you would, in the overseeing or governing of the other.
Right.
You know, very simple concept. So someone says, okay, then what's your point? Well, what we're coming down to with our question is, can the local church, in fulfilling the work of the Lord, can it use human institutions to fulfill its work?
Right.
You know, and that's kind of what we're going to look at this evening. Mm-hmm. Can the church? There's one Church of Christ near our neighborhood who had a Red Cross bus out in front. You know, other churches of Christ, you know, some of them may go so far as to bring a local radio station and DJ and have a party one day. And some churches of Christ will open up their building to whoever wants to make use of it. Right. You know, interacting with different institutions. And we're going to get more specific here in just a few minutes. But any thoughts before we...
Yeah, I'd like to put that question out there because I'm curious about this one. If
Yeah.
you're just saying the building, right? Just open up the building for anybody to use it. Is that okay? In other words, is it okay not to advertise yourself as the Church of Christ in your concept of opening up your building in an emergency situation?
Okay.
Let's say people want to come and take shelter even after the tornadoes pass. People have lost their homes. And a church in the community, not as the church, even though this is a very difficult line to figure out where the barrier is, but opens up its doors and lets the neighborhood know, hey, if you don't have a place to stay, you're welcome to sleep on the floor here.
Well, that is a good question.
And I don't know that we need to answer it right at this moment, but as we go through here, maybe just some thought for the chat room to chime in on.
About it. And is there a difference between the church that uses its building as a voting place,
right,
and a local church that, in the event of a major catastrophe, opens its doors for momentary shelter?
Right.
And
I think there's definite issues with things like, I forget what the organization is specifically called, but the Baptist ministry has a group of individuals who have a chainsaw group. And they specifically go out with chainsaws after events, and they're known as the Baptist, ministry. And they go out afterwards and cut trees down for people and move them out of the way. It's basically that's what they do. But they're known as they go out as that group.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely a difference in my mind, for sure, on going out and advertising as this group, as this church, doing this worldly function. Versus a church just having its door open.
Well, it's a little bit outside of the scope of this study.
Right.
A little bit. But let's kind of walk through this, and then we'll kind of ask the same question, if time permits at the end there. Any thoughts before we begin with our first section?
Guess 18 says, what about using a church building as a place to vote? And you mentioned that already, so I'm sorry, I went backwards.
Well, and what we're about to look at will ultimately answer that question.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
And then Randall says, that is incidental to the purpose of the work of the church versus the church opening a homeless shelter and running a business.
That's a very good point. It's
not that we're saying our purpose is, or that our intention is to provide some.
Well, last week we
function.
opened our doors to the
Right.
7 people who were outside.
Right.
And we came in and they used our facilities, which was fine. We turned on the ACs to kind of cool it down. Let's say the situation had been that we were here for 5 or 6 hours. Maybe it was so bad that we just had to bed down here for the night. That's an incidental use. That's not the purpose of the church. It's not, we're not advertising. And, I wouldn't have any problems with that because it's a momentary, incidental thing that will be gone tomorrow.
And I think I just bring that up because I think sometimes we should be cautious with how far we want to take something.
Right.
And no, we're a very conservative church. You can't come in as a shelter. No, this is not for shelter purposes. We're only teach the truth here.
We built this to praise God and to
Right.
study His Word, not to save your life.
Right.
So get out of here.
And ultimately, it is just that, a building.
Exactly.
That's what it is.
And it's the purposes. And let's talk about this for a few minutes here, because we won't have enough time if we keep this going. We've talked about authority before, okay? And what this boils down to, the answer to the question is simply a matter of authority. But when Jesus, right before He left this earth, He said to His apostles, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Okay, so all authority. So whatever Jesus taught, what the apostles would be inspired to talk, was from God. Subsequently, Paul, in his letter to the church in Colossae, in Colossians 3:17, wrote the following.
And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him.
All right, again, by His authority. So whatever the church does, which Jesus established, we must do by His authority. Our work, our purpose, our desires must be that which is based upon His instructions there. Now, how do we know what it is that we are supposed to do or not do? Well, in John 14:26, and we won't read this, but He made the promise to His apostles that He would send to them the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, who would teach them all things and bring into their remembrance all things that He had taught. And on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, we see this happening. The Holy Spirit came upon all the apostles, and they began to teach. And then, when you look, these apostles, they think about Paul's first journey he went on. He went around establishing congregations. In Acts 8, people were scattered abroad preaching the word. What were they doing? They were going out spreading the word of God. And when people obeyed the gospel in an area, they began to come together and they formed the local congregations. The church at Ephesus, the church in Smyrna, church in Laodicea, church in Philadelphia, Jerusalem, and Antioch, and Pisidia, and Cappadocia, and Lystra, and Iconium, and just on and on and on, there were congregations. And what was happening is these apostles, these inspired men, were teaching others to teach these congregations, and then teaching them themselves as well, what to do in the service of the Lord. And so as a result, we have these congregations as examples for us. John, we can look at some of these congregations, and some of them serve as examples of what not to do.
Right.
You know,
We're going to want to avoid the sins committed by some of those congregations, such as those at Corinth that Paul wrote to.
yeah.
And we can see that they made some corrections after his writings.
That's true.
In some cases. Those churches throughout Asia and throughout
5 of them.
Galatia.
Yeah, 5 of the churches throughout Asia had problems. And the churches throughout Galatia, many of the brethren there had taken on the Judaizing teachings position.
Right.
Yeah. But then there were good examples. The church in Thessalonica stands forth as a good example. Antioch, the church in Antioch and Jerusalem, Smyrna and Philadelphia were the 2 of the churches of Asia that he had no issues with. He just gave them commendations. And so what we have to do in striving to learn how we are to work and how we are to worship, we have to keep our eyes focused on the work of the churches in the first century. Whatever they set about to do is what we set about to do. Whatever they did through inspiration, we do by direction.
Right.
Any thoughts before we talk about kind of the 3 ways we establish?
Yeah, I
these
think
things?
Randall's thought goes along with this pretty well. As we were discussing earlier, incidental activities. He said incidental activities while at the building versus a planned and sponsored event. The purpose is the key.
Yes.
The church is all sufficient to do the work God has assigned it to do. If you create an institution separate and apart from the church to do the work of the church, then you violate the divine design. And Chanson mentioned earlier, Bible names institutions established by God. Bible ways, the way God dictates. And as we looked at some verses there, he also points out 2 John verse 9, whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so we're limited by those guidelines, those standards. And I like Randall's explanation there regarding the incidentals versus the purposes and intents.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And so-
And he goes on and after that says, many times, brethren, do not understand the difference between the work of the local church and the work of the individual.
That's right.
Right.
And especially among many churches of Christ. In Edmond, Oklahoma, there are several churches of Christ who don't see the difference there. If I can do it and you can do it and Travis can do it and you can do it and we're all a member of one congregation, if we can pull our funds together, why don't we just pull it out of the treasury? You know, if the individual can do it, the church can do it, is their belief. The situation of supporting widows in 1 Timothy chapter 5 shows a classic case in point, a perfect case in point, where not everything the individual could do could the church do.
Right.
You know, the individual could support their own widow at home. The church could not, unless she was truly a widow indeed.
Right.
You know, so, and if she was a widow indeed, then you wouldn't be there.
Right.
You'd be unable to support her, yeah. Now, there are typically 3 ways that we look at the examples of the churches in the first century, and we look at the teachings, and 3 ways that we come up with how a church is supposed to work and what we're supposed to do. Now, we've talked about these before, and if you remember the Church of Christ, you could probably say these in your sleep. But we have things that were given by direct command. I think about Paul's instructions to the church of Corinth, 1 Corinthians 11, in verse 23 through 26 regarding the Lord's Supper. This was a command. You know, not an example, not an inference. This case was a command.
Right.
All right.
We have proof examples
Exactly.
that you could look at.
Yeah.
And we see that in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7.
That's true.
An example of partaking of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week.
Exactly. There's an example. And the fact that he doesn't say every first day of the week, it is inferred that it is.
Right.
But there's also another inference in regards to the Lord's Supper.
Exactly. It's the other inferences, the bread which Jesus used in instituting the Lord's Supper was unleavened
Yeah.
due to the fact that it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
That's right. Paul didn't say when the brethren gathered together to break unleavened bread, and Paul didn't say, and Jesus, the Lord took the unleavened bread and broke it, but it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the only bread that would have been there would have been the unleavened bread.
Right.
Yeah.
And another idea that goes along a little bit with that in regards to the Lord's Supper is if you're going to partake of the fruit of the vine, there has to be some container.
Well, that's true.
So
That's
that's
true.
you got to hold it some way for you to partake of it.
That falls into the fourth realm of expediency. You know, we're told what to do. We see that we are to do, but we're not told the
Exactly
specifics.
how. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and that we call expedience. For instance, building a place, it is expedient for the church to build a place to fulfill the command to worship. You know, we are told to worship on the first day of the week. The number of times and what time is the expedient, is our choice. You know, that he leaves up to us.
Right.
Yeah. Any thoughts before we continue?
There's something rolling around in my brain, but it's not coming out right now, so I'm just going to pass on that.
Okay, it'll come here in just a moment. Now, someone says, okay, John, do you have any evidence to back this up? We don't have the time tonight to do a thorough study, but I would recommend you do a thorough study beginning with the book of Acts and go all the way through the book of Jude. And what you're going to do is when you study through Acts all the way through the book of Jude, and you can actually go to the first part of Revelation, you're looking for books that are written to local congregations and books that address the work of the local congregation. For instance, you go through Acts, you see examples of the local churches and what they did. Paul wrote the letter to the church in Rome that we know as Romans. Then he wrote letters to the church in Corinth. And then he wrote the letter to the churches throughout Galatia. Now we're going to set that one aside for a moment. Then he wrote one to the church at Ephesus, to Philippi, to Colossae, and then to Thessalonica. Now those are specific congregations. And if you look in each of those letters, you'll find something that addresses the work of the local church. And you can see in the writing that it was written to the local church. Someone says, what about the letter to the churches of Galatia? Well, in that case of Pointe, when you read that, that's not a letter addressing the collective working of the local church, but it's addressing the life of Christians in general. And I would even suggest that when he says the churches throughout Galatia, while it could be talking about the individual congregations, churches is called out, and it could be referencing all Christians throughout Galatia. But the point is, go through that study. And when you are done with that study, then I'll show you some observations that you will probably come across as you go through the study. And that's what we're about to look at here.
And of course, I was just popped into my head when you think about the book of Colossians. At the end of that book, he says, now when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans.
Exactly. There was a church of Laodicea. Now, in the lost books of the Bible, you'll find sometimes published, there's a letter to the church in Laodicea. But scholars have, when looking at with an open eye, that's not an authentic letter. It doesn't match Paul's writings, and there's certain things about it that just doesn't fit or doesn't hold up to the testing that they do and everything.
Right.
But there was a letter that he wrote to the Laodicean congregation. And I strongly suspect that there were more letters that Paul wrote. That these were just the ones that through providence were retained for our benefit. I'd be hard-pressed to say Paul wrote only one letter. We know with the church at Corinth, he wrote a letter prior to the two that we have. He makes reference to the earlier letter that he had written. But these are the two we have through providence of God, and it's what we need there. But look at some of the observations. And again, if you have any thoughts or comments, we'd love to hear from you, as well as emailing us. If you'd like to do that, we'll check our email at a later point. Send those to questions@scripturalway.org. But John, what's one of the first observations that we have here in the lesson?
Well, each congregation, we noticed, was under the oversight of a local eldership.
Right.
And no other eldership but the local eldership.
That's right.
Was to be of the oversight. And we look at 1 Peter chapter 5, and we notice in verse 2 where he tells the elders there to shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. So he told these elders to shepherd that flock, and he told them which flock to shepherd.
That's right.
This is the one that was among them. And if you go back to your thought about building the church as an expediency to meet the function, if you look over in 1 Corinthians...
Or building the building.
The building.
Yeah.
Right. If you look over in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 26, where he asks the question to them, how is it then, brethren, when you come together?
Right.
So he's talking about a congregation of brethren here who are in a particular area, an area among them that's in common where they could all come together at the same time fairly expeditiously.
And under the oversight of one eldership. Whether we're talking about the worship, the work, or even church discipline, these elders who were overseers, who were bishop, presbyters, overseers, this is what their responsibility was. And they were to answer to God for that. But what is interesting is when you study this, and this is kind of the point that you're making very well, you don't see where the church, where the elders in Jerusalem oversaw the work in Antioch. Now, they sent Paul and others to inquire about something that was going on, okay? But it wasn't saying, okay, here we are ruling over you. And even in Acts 15, some people look at that as the church in Jerusalem having an oversight over the church in Antioch and other locations. I don't see that. We see inspired men being sent by the eldership here to go and teach the brethren further, or at least to make sure the truth is being taught. Not because they oversaw, but because they were concerned about the work of the Lord being done, the truth being taught properly.
Right.
Yeah. And I could even see, you have to tread carefully, but I could see a congregation sending their local preacher. Listen, we've heard this congregation's having some issues. They've written us to kind of help out as far as in an indirect way. We're going to send you down there and maybe a couple of brethren to study with them. And what they decide to do with it is their own choice, but we're going to help them. I mean, in the kind of way that's what gospel meetings are, but just in reverse. Congregations bring a man in to preach the word. So, but we also, there are no examples of the elders of one church, and this is what we're talking about, overseeing the work of other churches. Acts 15's case in point, that doesn't support that. That's not a case of one eldership, and we've already talked about that. But what about the third one, though, John?
Each congregation is also responsible for its own work.
Now, this is an interesting point that you can only deduce through observation of study.
We examine the instructions there written to and about various congregations. To show that point to be true, we look at preaching the gospel.
Right.
And the direction for the local congregation to spread the word.
Right.
Edification, to edify those that are coming together, to edify one another in that activity. And then benevolence, again, providing benevolence to those in the congregation that are in need.
That's right. It wasn't the church in Thessalonica's responsibility to edify the church in Macedonia, to help strengthen the church in Laodicea on a regular basis. It was their local responsibility. Now, the church in Thessalonica did such a good job that Paul commends them, saying the faith had come forth from them and it had been made known because of their obedience and service unto the Lord. But if there's a congregation down the road, it's not our responsibility to edify them. It's our responsibility to edify ourselves and let them, as a collective group, answer to the Lord themselves. 7 churches of Asia, the Lord at no point said, okay, now you in Philadelphia and you in Smyrna, y'all need to take off and go straighten these other churches out. No examples of it.
And one of the things that you see there is if you're doing as a local congregation what you should to edify, to teach the word, to build each other up in the faith, that in itself, as other congregations hear of it, should be edifying.
Exactly.
As Paul mentioned, as you talked about earlier, other churches were used as good examples.
That's right. That's exactly right. Also, another observation, there are no examples of a congregation taking on the work of other churches. Each congregation tended to its work and took on no work larger than what it could handle. Now, this is an observation. It's not a direct statement found in the text there, but it's something that you see when you look at all the instances. Yes, the church in Jerusalem did send men down to Antioch to make sure the truth was being taught. They did address some questions about the Gentiles, okay? But they were not stepping into and doing the work of other churches. And sometimes people say, yeah, but our church is so small, we have to have help. No, the Lord designed the local church for even the small church to do what they can. What happens is, and what happens is I think sometimes is small churches think, well, we don't have all the great means, so we're going to help pay other churches for them to. The Herald of Truth did that. So a lot of televisions today, a lot of small churches pat themselves on the back because they send $100 a month to this television ministry or to that radio ministry. Listen, if you really want to do the work of the Lord, you get out in your own community. You don't have to have a radio program. You don't have to have a television program. You don't even have to have an internet program. You have to be able to communicate with people, and you go talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how Lord intended for the small church. You plant, you water, God gives the increase. Right. If a church is 1,000 members, again, you focus on the local level, doing your own work locally, not the work of a bunch of other churches.
Yeah. It comes down to the ability to be satisfied with what you have.
Exactly. Exactly.
As a local congregation, if you're 20 people, if you're 50 people, if you're 100, not that you're satisfied to the extent that you don't go try to teach and spread the word, but you're not dissatisfied so that you then go outside of the Word of God to try to somehow help Him out. Because, we should be bigger than this, and if we were to do these 3 different things that God has not authorized us to do, well, we would grow greatly.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, you didn't grow spiritually. You may have grown in numbers, but you didn't grow spiritually.
If we grow spiritually and if we grow in our service to the Lord, the local church will grow.
Right.
And I tell you what's interesting, when you look at it historically, you can have 2 congregations that are 25 in attendance. The first congregation began 2 months ago, and they're brand new. The other congregation's been there for 60 years. The one's been there 60 years, odds are they're dying. The one that's been there for 2 months, they're growing. And I've never quite understood that. You could have the same number of members, but this one church that is new works and they grow. Mm-hmm. But the one that's 25 has been there for 60 years, probably the reason why they're 25 is they quit working.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
And that comes down to that satisfaction issue about you want to be satisfied, but not content to just stay with what you are and not try to grow by spreading the word.
Yeah.
So satisfied, I didn't mean to imply just be happy with what you are and don't make any effort to be.
You're talking about being
anymore.
Satisfied with your number and working with that number. Exactly.
Right. Working with that number to do what the Lord has required us to do.
That's exactly right there. Now there is one instance of where a church did send funds to another congregation. Mm-hmm. That's found in Acts 11, 27 through 30. Paul referenced it on a couple of his letters when in church in Rome and the church in Corinth as well there, where Agabus foretold a famine coming to the region of Judea. So the disciples at Antioch, they each took of their own means and they sent it by the hands of Paul and Barnabas, I believe it was, up to Jerusalem to give to the elders. All right, so it's, there you have an example of one church sending money to another church. What's the specifics of the example? It was for benevolence for the needy saints. Mm-hmm. Now, I did know a brother a number of years ago who looked at that and said, see, that's our example where one church can send money to another church. Especially if it's for evangelism, go right ahead. If it's help them build a new building, go right ahead. This church sent money to that church, therefore could be done. But the purpose of it is what's pertinent to that. And if you limit it to the purpose, then you find that we stick within the guidelines we see in the Scriptures here.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting how this backs right back up to responsibility and roles again.
It absolutely.
Just like we talked about in the relationship with women in the church, just like we talked about with men and the family or women in the family, the same thing is true with church and the community.
Big or small.
They have a particular role, a particular responsibility, and they need to fulfill that and focus on fulfilling that role and not avoid fulfilling that role in efforts to do some other great thing that they think is more beneficial.
Exactly.
And it's interesting as you go through here how you could apply most all these things to the family. The husband is to support his family. Yeah. He's not responsible for supporting other families.
That's true.
Now, he can provide some support to them if they ask and if he has the means. More than a good thing to provide for others as well if you have that capability. He's to teach his family. Right. He's not responsible for teaching other families, but he's responsible for teaching others.
Exactly.
And so it's kind of interesting as you go through this, if you apply it to the family, most of these things would still would translate very well.
Well, this goes back to the institutions that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. The Leech Local Congregation is its own institution, governed by the rules that God set up for that. Family the same, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. 2 last points here real quick before we get into the application. We see no example of a local congregation sending money to another church for efforts such as evangelism or edification. There's just no example of it whatsoever. And if someone says, yeah, but just because we don't have an example doesn't mean that we can do that, be careful, because what else do you get to bring in now? Mm-hmm. There's so much you can bring in if you use the Bible doesn't say that we can't argument.
Right. And finally, we see no example of a local congregation using an institution other than itself to do the work of the local church.
And that's kind of where the whole point of this study. And someone says, well, give us an example of what you're talking about, of where a church would use a human institution. Well, we're going to look at that. Some actual applications of that. But we have been going on at 90 miles an hour for the last 5-10 minutes, and our chat room has been letting us do that because they know that we don't want to go over too far. We will a little bit tonight, so I want to complete the study, and so that we can have a clean start when we come back. But if you have any thoughts or comments, especially now, some of the applications here, we're getting ready to go into these. Let us hear them. The first thing, and this one, if you go into the history of it, started back in the early 30s and 40s, finally along 50s and 60s, some brethren began to question it. And that is, there were some churches that, college, quote unquote, Church of Christ colleges were formed. And a lot of congregations were sending money to those churches, or to those colleges. And a lot of people say it's a good work. Hey, our church sends $100 a month to this college or that college. They're doing so much good. The thing is, the college is a man-made institution overseen by man. The college is not a local church with needy members. The college is not a preacher working with a local congregation. The college is a separate human organization not to be funded by the local church. There's no authority for it.
Right.
There's no evidence that Paul, when he taught the school of Tyrannus, that the school received funds from Paul. Or from the local church. Where was it? Corinth or Ephesus? I drew a blank. Help me out there in the chat room there. That the church didn't send money to the school. They were still helping Paul. He just used it as a means of a teaching place there. What about orphan homes, John?
Yeah, we see the church is not authorized to send money to orphan homes, and for many of the same reasons, as we note, and that will be a common theme. Orphan homes are man-made institutions as well, and they are overseen by
man. That's right.
They're not a local church with needy members.
That's right.
Matter
of fact,
go ahead.
Not to interrupt you, but I am interrupting you. A lot of orphan homes do not have orphans. A lot of orphan homes these days have problem children. Not parentless children.
Right.
So they've even gone away from the original idea they had for that.
Right.
But it's still man-made, yeah.
Right, and I had another thought in my mind, which is where I was thrown off here a moment ago, when we were talking about colleges. So if I can back up just for a second, and some people will use that logic. Well, they're teaching the Bible in that college. Right. They have Bible classes and whatnot, and so that's why it's okay to send money to them. And the same argument rebukes that as the argument we just made, and that is that's a man-made institution. Right. And God gave the authorization for, I would say, 3 areas of teaching the Word. And that being the local congregation, first off. Second off, in the home, for parents to teach their family. And then third off, for us as Christians to go and teach.
That's right.
And there were no other requirements or commands or authorizations for institutions to be set up and for churches to then support that effort. And because if you're supporting that effort because you're teaching the Word, then some way you're taking away from your local effort to teach that Word.
That's right. Acts 19, Ephesus, School of Tyrannus. Sleeping on me, chat room. No, I'm kidding. But now, let's talk about orphan homes for just a moment, though, because James 1:27, let's pull that up on the screen here. James says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. People will say, okay, that justifies the church sending $100 to such and such orphan homes. My question is, though, first off, is this a letter to a local church? And the answer is no. It's a letter to the individual. Okay, well, there's no doubt there about this one. Second thing is, look at the time frame. I would suggest, and I'm not a Greek scholar by any stretch, but I would suggest that when he says to visit the orphans or fatherless and widows, that sounds like a family that has lost their father. For some reason we separate them, and the widows are an old group of ladies, or a group of old ladies, and the orphans are a separate group of children. Why must they be separate? Why aren't these families that have simply lost their fathers? Also, during this time period, they didn't have the social organizations that we have to help provide for these situations there. And more importantly, I don't believe that James was talking about finding some orphans in Timbuktu to support. I believe he was talking about those among your number. You know, if there was a child without parents, then as a local members, you take them in. If there's a widow, you take them in. I mean, it's just so clear to me that he's talking about local responsibilities as we have the means, not the church cutting a check for $100 and sending it here, sending it there.
Right. You know, and you could even just open it up and say, for the sake of argument, let's say that somehow this is talking to a local church, which, you know, it isn't.
Okay.
But what's the most you could gain out of this verse? Well, the whole church should go visit them.
Yeah.
It didn't say send money.
No.
It says to go visit.
And not simply visit, say, hey, how's it going?
Right.
But to take food to them,
Right.
to take clothing to them.
So the whole church should be going over there. If that's about all you could get, even if it was talking to a
Exactly.
church.
It wouldn't justify the church taking funds, sending it to some man-made orphan home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, you know, I've never seen any widow home.
Right.
We've lived in a widow home before. It's got 1,500 square feet. It's kind of, never mind. Play on words there. Let's move on, though, before y'all abandon us here.
Randall in the chat room mentions, he says, I always ask the brethren who want to bring in these unauthorized practices, where do these things come from? It's not the Bible, but denominationalism, just as in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel 8, verse 6, or just like the Jews.
Yes, yeah.
1 Samuel 8, verse 6.
Yeah.
But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us.
That's right.
When the people became dissatisfied with the institution that God had set up for ruling them, and looked around to the world out there and said, "Hey, they have kings.
That's a good
Well,
point.
we need one of those kings."
Yeah, we need to be like them.
Right.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. Yeah.
He also Randall mentions all unauthorized practices come from the world or denominations, not the Bible. If we are going to be the New Testament church, then we have to use the New Testament pattern as you have shown tonight. James 1 verse 27 is clearly individual instruction, as you mentioned.
I had a preacher years ago tell me that he had heard it said that you watch the denominational trends, and it's like throwing a log in a river upstream. It'll eventually come downstream, and churches will start doing it. Churches of Christ will, and that's true. We've seen that.
Sarah mentioned time is worth more than money. People can more easily give up money than time. And that's a good point. You know, when it does talk about even if it is, you know, even as it is addressing individuals and most likely dealing with those of their family.
Right.
Even in that case, a lot of times it's easier just to send well wishes, just to send some dollars, than to go over there and actually take the time and get involved. And
Yeah. How many times do we tell someone who's sick or afflicted, if you need anything, call me? Now, I understand, because I say that. If you need anything, call me, because I don't know what to do. But there are some people, they don't say that. They just show up your door with a bowl of chicken noodle soup. You know, they're just coming. And it is that concern that we are to be looking at there.
Right.
Chance makes a good point from James 1:27. He says, we do see orphans and widows mentioned as an individual concern. Widows and the fatherless would have been under an obvious disadvantage and worthy of mention. And I think a definite problem that they would have had, I think even more so than our country and our culture today.
right,
Yeah.
definitely.
A couple other applications where churches are using human institutions to do the work of the church. Missionary societies. This cropped up again early on within our country. And it seemed like a good idea at the time. Tell you what, instead of one man receiving a half a dozen checks from a half a dozen churches, and he's over in this third world country, we'll form a missionary society. And all the churches send the money to us, and then we'll cut a check to that one guy there. Sounds like a good plan. Problem is, there's just no example for it. Missionary societies are organizations created by man to do the work that belongs to the churches. 10th and Francis, this congregation, back in the mid 40s, early 50s, before they made the change, for a year and a half, churches were sending money to this congregation, and it was cutting individual checks to various men in Africa. I came across this when I was doing the research, because when they stopped doing that, and they told these other churches, we can no longer do this because it's unscriptural, they were land blasted. And there's this one preacher in his biography, land blast the 10th and Francis Church for their decision to stop. And there is no authority for one church to do what other churches as individual congregations should be doing. You can't do the work for them. And missionary societies are no different than that, just no Bible example. Yeah.
Missionary societies are overseen by men, as you mentioned. They're controlling money being sent from autonomous congregations and elderships, and then the missionary societies are not local churches.
They're not. They're supporting preachers.
Right.
And individual people can support preachers.
Right.
But they're not local churches, but they're receiving money as if. Yeah. And as we already said, there's no commands, no examples, no inferences to draw the support for a missionary society. Yeah. Another application, though?
Well, I was just going to say, we're already over. Something with you in the word word versus world this week, isn't there?
I'm having trouble with that.
Well,
I am preaching of the world.
Just one of those things.
Yeah.
Last one here, churches are not authorized to support or take on a bigger work, a work bigger than itself.
Now, listen to that again, all right? The application, churches are not authorized to support or take on a work bigger than itself. Okay, let's explain what we mean by that.
Well, we see a local church here is to support their own local evangelistic efforts.
Yeah. Now, pause. A church can send money to preachers in other areas. That's fine. Okay, so they are stepping outside of their local area. But what we're talking about, though, is when it comes down to evangelistic work, it's what they are able to do and what they are able to support and the work that they do. Because many churches, they'll send money, smaller church will send money to some big church because to help their, or some big church will send money to a smaller church to help their evangelistic efforts. And that's not what we're talking about. The elders of the local church oversee only the efforts of the local group. This was the problem with the Herald of Truth program. And there's actually two locally that originate out of Edmond, Oklahoma there, where each week when the program goes off, you see the list of churches that sent money to that. Well, what's happening is those churches are taking on, the church with the program has taken on a work bigger than itself. It cannot support this work, so it has to pull in money from other churches. And if you cannot support it yourself, the local church should not do it. You know, I think it's wonderful to be able to send the message to Timbuktu, but we first need to get it locally and grow the local church large enough. If you want to do a TV program, then grow the local church big enough to support it. You know.
You know, it's pretty sad, but it took me that you making that point for me finally to catch on exactly what you were talking about with that point.
Oh, yeah.
I was a little bit lost tonight for some reason on that one, but I get you now.
Yeah.
I'm on track.
And in all fairness, I wrote John at 5 o'clock today, hey, did you get the email I sent you?
And about 6:20 I got that text.
Yeah. Say, we're going to be adding one more lesson tonight, so I didn't give it to him very early, to say the least there.
But you do see local churches here do have enough responsibility to attend to being the pillar and ground of the truth in its community.
And that's the key. I'm telling you what, there's enough work locally for every individual congregation. They don't have any business trying to do some work somewhere else or involved in some man-made institution. Do the work locally, do the work as individuals, and let the local church what it can do collectively, and the work will grow. God has promised us, Paul promised us, you plant the seed, you water the seed, God gives the increase. And if churches aren't growing, more than likely it's because people aren't working. And it's that simple.
Right.
You know, I realize grounds can be hard, but still, you got to work it. You got to work it and do your own work, not the work of someone else. And so that brings us to the end of this study. Very, very quickly done. This may be one of the fastest ones we've gone through, although we did go over time, so that kind of knocks off the bragging rights there a little bit. But if you disagree with anything that we've talked about, let us know. We don't pretend to know everything. If we don't think that we know everything, we know that we don't. That's for certain. If you think that we have approached this in the wrong manner, or maybe we have misrepresented it, please let us know. You can send your comments and questions to questions@scripturalway.org. And when we come back on July 10th, if we have any disagreeing questions, and we may take a few minutes to address it before we actually start the lesson of what does the Bible say about alcohol and the life of a Christian. So,
All right.
Yeah. John, any thoughts or comments?
Oh, great discussion in the chat room there. We had a little break, like you said, in the chat, but it was active for the beginning and the end there, so we appreciate that.
Well, I think they were letting us because they knew we wanted to get through, and they agreed with everything we said.
Yeah, that's what we're going to go with.
Listen, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. It means so much to us that you're willing to take your time on this, out of this busy Tuesday afternoon. You know, I feel bad. The Thursday night, the virtual Bible study, I have been so busy for the last 2 months. I've not been able to tune into that. But it, you know, and I know Tuesday nights may be the same way for some people.
Mm-hmm.
And the virtualbiblestudy.com, they do a live broadcast out of Columbia, Tennessee, at 8 o'clock on Thursday night, Central Standard Time. Very good job that they do there. But I recognize that your lives get busy and you can't always make our study, but I appreciate it when you can. And you'll have the archives to go back and watch and catch up on anything if you'd like to do that. Well, here again, we're saying goodbye until July 10th. Next week, join us for worship services start at 7 o'clock. The live stream there for that. And Maurice Barnett will do a very fine job.
Looking forward to it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much. And Lord willing, we'll see you back here again on July 10th. Have a very wonderful month as we go into it.